on one of the episodes about how cool it would have been to have like Lyotard and Baudrillard pair up for their own sort of D&G like assemblage.
Yeah. That would have been cool.
That would have been fucking amazing.
That would have really
What is it
gone all
called?
the way.
A canceled future we never got.
The very rules of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemist. The whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry, as always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Also sponsored by @outsideness on twitter.com. Before we get started with today's guest, just want to mention I have a Patreon at patreon.com/MUHH. If you're enjoying the show, do consider throwing us $1 a month to help. We have reconvened the Libidinal band for another deep dive into Lyotard's libidinal economy, and I've got the usual suspects joining me: Taylor Adkins, cute Noumena, a young Agamben, as we look at Chapter 5, Capital, from the Hamilton translation of libidinal economy. Welcome back to the what is it? The dojo, maybe we can call it.
The dojo.
The libidinal dojo.
Enter the void.
The inner sanctum.
I guess we can also announce officially that Taylor's going to be joining the podcast as official co-host. So that's really exciting news. Looking forward to making that official. I feel like you've been the unofficial co-host for the last year or so.
Hey, yeah, I mean, I'm just a recurring guest. You can't get rid of me.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So it's a perfect name, a better duo. You can't.
That's crossover since Deleuze and Guattari.
I just can't quit you.
I have joked with Taylor about this because I do think it is kind of funny that he's like the Deleuze in this duo because he's the philosophy expert guy, and I'm like the wacky Lacan, the militant wacky Lacan stan.
Yeah. Works perfectly.
Now we just need to get you to memorize Lacan like Guattari did.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
That was horrifying to read in the biography, that he literally memorized Lacan and would just, he'd get you in a corner and just fucking reiterate it to you. And that sounds like, honestly, it's base, but it sounds fucking like torture.
Yeah.
Sounds kind of cringe. Where okay, cringe only in as far as people on Twitter do the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Mucho texto.
It's like
Mucho texto. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
What is it? Is it affirmation a little bit that it wasn't until I think I talked to Andrew Culp that I even knew that Guattari was kind of a student of Lacan's.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was kind of very validating, I guess, that he saw something in Lacan's ideas, at least initially, that kind of propelled his intellectual journey and trajectory.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, all the cool kids were doing Lacanian psychoanalysis in the 60s.
This is a really dense chapter.
Yeah.
And I think, again, I've mentioned that recency bias in terms of how much I enjoyed this chapter in comparison to the rest of the book, but
yeah,
I don't know. I think this was an amazing chapter. The content is pretty riveting, I think.
Yeah, and very eclectic.
Yeah.
So many disparate schools of thought just kind of smashing into each other in a beautiful, destructive, creative destruction.
Right. Yeah, because it's a sort of mashup of everything from Taoism and to the 1929 stock market crash.
Yeah.
So we're running a pretty wide gamut, and then even discussion of credit and so forth, but also the Chinese erotics, the Athenian erotics.
It might be helpful to kind of at first separate some of these pieces because they're pretty difficult to understand how they play in. The thing about opening up with Taoism specifically, I was really interested in this. It seems to me like there's a specific argument being made here, and I'll just read. Can I read a quote from 206 in the Hamilton? he says explicitly about the Tao, how it relates. And he says, if the Tao is important to us libidinal economists, it is not because of its nihilism, but because of its refinement and the search for and the affirmation of mutability, and thereby the non-existence in it of the question of the subject. It's almost like the Tao is not passively not, or at least libidinal economy is not Taoist in that passive nihilism, but there's a libidinal affirmation here of what the Tao, sort of the same underlying material that the Tao is commenting on. But I was wondering what exactly that affirmation is of in your guys' minds. I have a few ideas, obviously, but I was really interested, and I think it's helpful for me personally, and probably for people reading the book, about coming to grips with why Lyotard starts with this like connection to Taoism.
He leaves that an open question as well, does he not?
Right.
I picked up on the same passage, but go ahead, Taylor.
We talked about it last night where he seems to come out of left field making that claim, and part of the claim about the non-existence of the subject, this being a non-problem for Taoist erotics. And it seems like he comes back to it in the next paragraph when he starts to go into the Meyer-May stuff about the he doesn't say Meyer-May, but he starts to talk about the non-place that sweeps over the labyrinthine band rather than circumscribing it. And he says sort of towards the end of that next paragraph about, he goes from Taoist erotics to no theater and the kind of undecidability of the gestures in no, this kind of hyper, I guess these like sort of micro differentiations in the gestures and the tilting of the body and etc. So he talks about this non-place or unthinkable place, which is precisely the passage of intensity. That's the only way I could make sense of Lyotard making the leap that the stuff that he had remarked about from the Manual of Love of male harnessing, the yang harnessing the female energies. I felt like that was perhaps the leap, but I'm not convinced, but I'm excited by that claim because it does feel like a claim more than something that obviously in the whole book he has been moving this way where he seems to always be like pushing us forward or dragging us behind, and we're always playing catch up or having to like coordinate with Lyotard, who's not always going to explain things. So I don't know. What did you guys think?
I really like what you said, because I kind of was leading in that direction to this carving out of a non-place. And it seems like Lyotard has both Taoist erotics and madness as sort of, at least not the only, but two of the major paths to carving out a non-place, which makes sense in what you were saying, Taylor, that a non-place sort of is inherently a madness, an unrepresentability of just pure intensity that separates itself off from what I would call like the consensus reality, or what Lyotard might call like the mutually agreed upon slowing down of the band, the mutually agreed upon representation of subjectivity and objectivity that we have.
Do we want to go back and talk a little bit about just setting up how he gets even to the point that Chris and I have discussed, this question of Taoist erotics implying the non-existence of the subject, or at least not being a problem for it, like we might find in traditional Western philosophy. I mean, do we want to talk a little bit about this opening up of what's going on with this interplay of energies?
So much of that discussion just brought to mind Lacan so much, and just in terms of that, I don't know if zero is necessarily lack. I think maybe it's more of some type of like a virtual thing for Lyotard. On that note, let me just see what you guys think about this, because I picked up and read a little bit from Seminar 16 from Lacan from 69, and I almost wonder if Lyotard's in attendance, and I'll read directly from this translation. The most characteristic, the most subtle form that we have given of the function cause of desire is what is called masochistic enjoyment. It is an analogical enjoyment, namely that at the level of surplus enjoying. The subject takes on a qualified fashion this position of loss, of waste product that is represented by zero. And his whole effort is to constitute the other as the field simply articulated in the style of this law, of this contract, which our friend Deleuze has so happily emphasized to supply for the trembling imbecility that reigns in the field of psychoanalysis. So I don't know if that necessarily has any purchase in terms of this non-subject, but I feel like maybe that's my shitty understanding of Lacan, is that there is a certain similarity here.
Lyotard's he makes a little swipe at Lacan, though, right? He brings him up to dismiss him, and because Lacan is, at least for the psychoanalysts, and that the school that he tries to carve out and the identity he tries to give it is precisely, Lacan is resurrecting this theory of the subject and giving it central importance. Badiou says the same thing by like turning to Lacan and Descartes that the theory of the subject is paramount and can't just be swept away like by quote unquote postmodernism or post-structuralism. And I think Lyotard is here again. He doesn't really argue with Lacan or argue against him. He just brings him up in relation to it. Where is it? He says,
I found
the quote.
Yeah, I've got a good quote from this should be 205. Such a displacement requires the production on the woman's part as of the man's of subjects, that is to say, of unitary and empty instances, which by definition will in fact never be sufficiently owned, since they are only an instantiation of zero of the pulsions. Continuing in this direction, one soon discovers so-called modern problematics, such as are found in Lacan, which highlights notions of the lack of jouissance, manque à jouir, and the elusiveness of the libidinal object. Let's observe, however, that these problematics are not in fact dominated by precisely that which does not in any way hang over Taoist thought, even less its erotics, the category of the subject. For if the Tao is important to us libidinal economists, it is not because of its nihilism, but because of its refinement in the search for an affirmation of that mutability and therefore the non-existent. Okay, so that's the same quote.
Yeah.
The non-existence in of it of the question of the subject.
So it's just interesting that because when he does bring up Lacan in this text, and we've talked about it almost every time we've gotten together and questioned whether or not he was at the seminars and attendance and these other things. But whenever he brings up Lacan in this text, it's never in the way like he does with Marx or with Freud even, where there seems to be a theoretical point. With Lacan, it always seems to be just a kind of, what was it in chapter 3 where he quotes Lacan's definition of love, right? Giving someone what we don't have, who doesn't want it.
Right.
Yeah, and he but he gives that weird definition about crying near lightning strikes. It's like, it's not clear what Lyotard is trying to do, except I guess for us to kind of call into question or to doubt, why is it that Lacan where is that difference, right? That like Lacanian subjectivity becomes paramount, whereas with Taoist erotics, that's a non-problem. I don't know what to do with it. Yeah, honestly.
I was just gonna, because I really like the Tao Te Ching, just for my own personal reading. I really like going back to that, and I write down a lot of the quotes, but I was sort of trying to be like, what is he saying when he's saying the Tao is a libidinal economic in a way, or at least coincides with a libidinal economic sort of tradition. I was just going to read in the Tao Te Ching, there's a couple verses in, the first few, in the one I have, it's listed by number, but I didn't write the numbers down. So there's just a few lines though, right after each other, where it says, the Tao seems empty, yet it is never exhausted. It dulls its own sharpness, breaks its own bonds, dims its own brightness, identifies with its own dust. The space between Earth and the stars is like a bellows. It is empty, but does not collapse. As it contracts, it creates. In my mind, it makes sense that Lyotard would want to identify kind of with the Tao, because in the Tao, there's sort of this concept of the libidinal band in a way, not expressed in that kind of metaphorical way, but the libidinal band,
Right.
so to speak, is the Tao. But I would argue it's sort of the way the Tao expresses itself, because if the Tao is passively nihilist, the guy who wrote it just went into the woods, left society, and said, I'm done. Here's how everything works. It's the Tao, the way. He's saying, like, that's not what we want out of it. The passive nihilism of it, of just being like, okay, I understand things. But the Tao sort of represents something that can be understood as libidinal economics. If you kind of say the way is actually, that sort of heating up of the libidinal band that also cools itself down.
Right.
It dulls its own sharpness, breaks its own bonds, dims its own brightness, and identifies with its own dust. So I sort of see, in a way, this connection between the Tao and why it's sort of important to libidinal economists. But these are obviously only my subjective connections from reading the Tao and reading libidinal economy.
Maybe that discussion of, or that sort of juxtaposition that he discusses with the sexual practices of the Athenians versus the Taoist erotics. Remember, because he's kind of contrasting those two approaches to, you might even say, approaches to libidinal economy.
Yeah.
And Taylor and I discussed last night that there is this, on the Greek side, it's the sexual act with a woman is merely to propagate there's no, it's sort of the desire, the libidinal cathexis is for the homoeroticism.
To make more men.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Contrasted with the Taoist erotics, where there's more of it almost, now that you mention that sort of model of the libidinal band applying to Taoism, I think that brings things into a bit of a sharper focus, as far as it does have that sort of, because it is sort of that two-dimensional, that permeable membrane between each side, and the flows of desire and energy back and forth, the potential for reversal, because the man, by bringing the woman to orgasm, can sort of reabsorb, I think typically, the model is the woman absorbs the male, I guess the semen is
it's like the energy source. I mean, the way he says it, it's almost like in the Chinese erotics, the man shouldn't come, shouldn't ejaculate, because they're storing,
almost like the nofap kind of ideology of we don't want to expend our precious bodily fluids.
Literally, yeah.
And he makes the point that there's also, the woman's handbook for different exercises to conserve her essence and her. So it's kind of like a wrestling match. And, so it is, as you said, it is about intensification. And he even says, there's the difference between the Greek penis and the Chinese penis, as you're getting at, Coop, right? That the Greek penis is let's come in the womb and make the baby, and that's not a result of the intensification. That's just a necessary evil, so to speak. Right. Yeah. Exactly. To continue the homosociality and the homosexuality that's desired, at least as the goal. But in Taoist erotics, it seems like when you do come, you have had to have practiced all of these ways of conserving and intensifying and damming up, such that, and this gets back to what Chris was, why quoting the Tao was great, because this is where Lyotard says that the Taoist erotics start to shift towards a mysticism, a cosmology, and a hygienics, right? Because the end goal would be not just for the health of the male to keep the semen in, but also provisionally to have beautiful male heirs. So it's interesting, right? Because I think with the Taoist erotics, the goal is like an optimum, right? Because obviously, ideally, at the limit, if all you're making is male heirs, you're not going to have any wombs to eventually make more. So it's this kind of optimum shifting of forces and energies and of potentially inexhaustible surpluses.
That's such an interesting. That's such an interesting tension between those two. You could even map that onto the Taoist yin yang energy, right? Yeah. Because on one side there's very little libidinal cathexis in terms on the Greek side, But there is very much so, it's very much so the opposite in terms of the Taoist erotics, right?
Right. He says that the Greeks for the Greeks, the female orgasm wasn't a problem, wasn't really a question, wasn't a goal to attain either. I mean, I'm sure there were some aspiring young bucks who were like, yeah, I can do that. But that wasn't, at least, I mean, again, I'm sure there are, outliers and exceptions, because of course we're moving in these broader generalizations, but
right.
It does kind of follow from the logic that we laid out last time with the Lydians prostituting their daughters, thereby sterilizing them. And so it's the object of exchange is the womb is sort of empty and barren. I mean, it's obviously a kind of violent way, but I guess that's why he moves immediately from Taoist erotics to the no theater, because it is a kind of dance. It is it's a different type of exchange than what we see him talking about in the Mercantilist, the trade, the trade section.
I was going to mention briefly, because I think you guys all touched on really good points, but it reminds me of like the first part of the book itself about the flattening out of the body.
Yeah.
Kind of like expanding on it. How would I say it? Like this, making something horizontal or like expanding out in the flat level. If that makes sense.
De-stratifying?
Yeah, like de-stratifying, I guess, like, so in terms of like the de-stratification, what you have here is, I want to say like in like a Landian terms, like going towards like the inhuman, if that makes sense. You see a transferring of essences or like energies, which you can connect to like thermodynamics, which I think Lyotard goes later into this.
He does mention
in
the second
chapter.
law, yeah.
But in a way, it's like an inhuman transfer. You dissolve the subject or the ego, you could say, and instead you have these external forces that you can use to explain individual or atomized instances. And so instead of having like these concrete transactional, how would you say, like these transactional exchanges, you have these flows of energy, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Just like if you had that, it's diffusion, right, between membranes. So like if you have that membrane in between two things and you heat up one side, right, versus the other, that's going to create, you know what I mean? Like the great ocean conveyor belt, right, too, as well as like a good example of how that heat versus cold and the flows and how that sort of reaches that equilibrium point.
Unless you have a negative entropy machine. Maxwell's demon,
Cute. That does remind me, at some point in the text, he mentions something about the head. Ultimately, however, a head is necessary to which something flows back and is reserved, an instance of collection and relief coupled with the intention to reach one or even several goals. At first, what offers the most mystical and also most popular goals is immortality, the return to mutability, to the void, and the loss of false subjectivity in weakness, which is true strength.
I mean, it goes without saying he's speaking in terms of the Tao. Yeah. Right? That weakness is quote unquote true strength from that perspective of you just look at some of the passages that Chris mentioned, and that holds.
I was thinking about that head though in the like terms of does this have anything to do with this flattening out of structure of like the way that Deleuze and Guattari do in terms of like de-stratification or like rhizomatic versus arboreal?
I was thinking just more that it was related to him, the initial block quote, which said that reserving the orgasm, the semen turns back towards the brain, towards the head.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's really all that he's saying here. I mean, I don't want to like say you're wrong. That's just how I took it. Right.
Gotcha.
But logically, him basically saying.
But is the head like the head of what, of the system, or of like, I don't know. I just want to kind of flesh out what he's getting at as far as like that return to the head. Is he saying that the head is a necessary evil, or?
I think here it's a metaphor or an analogy for the reservoir,
the energy
image that he'll bring out, right? And so the head would be in terms of, if we're thinking of the body as a with all of its organs, not flattened out as Cute was talking about.
Yeah.
Just in a simple kind
Right.
of image. Yeah, I guess the head would be if not the source, then the intensified reservoir.
Right.
Because it does go back to how he starts off the chapter, right? That there's the different expenditures, right? That in the trade chapter, expenditures always imply some sort of return on investment, right? Whether it be the lay, whether it be the analytics session, but at the same time, inevitably, there's always going to be, the system's always going to lose some sort of energy due to heat loss, and he says smoke, and I believe he calls it a dissipation of quantities of pulsions, and he includes jouissance in that, right?
Yeah.
So
Should I
think
read this quote about expenditures?
Yeah,
I
go
think
ahead.
I think this is exactly what you're talking about. Expenditures are far from being, as we have seen, absolute liberations from the reproductive cycle. The outpourings of pulsional intensities pouring towards an alleged outside always give rise to a double process. On one hand, a more or less important proportion of these libidinal quantities is compensated for by a return, the doxina, payment for the lay, for the session, for words themselves, when they concern the small change of language, the concept. On the other hand, this process dissipates an irreversible and unusual quantity of pulsions as heat, as smoke, as jouissance, in any cycle of this type. These are on the circle, then, effects of transmutation barely interrupted by expenditure as pure loss, i.e. by extravagant jouissances. But there still remains the whole question of what jouissance on the circle consists in. At most, we understand that this jouissance is perverse, in contrast to those coursing through the sacrificial, analytic, or prostitutive offering, just as, conversely, the latter are if the former is taken as the point of instantiation. We have still to seize this jouissance affirmatively, the model of which we have given somewhat arbitrarily as the mercantile function of the Greek city.
I was going to mention, this reminds me of Bataille in reference to like expenditure. Just, I guess, yeah, I don't know. I think he's making, what is it called? An implicit
Explicit?
connection there. Or yeah, I guess explicit.
Well,
I guess he
now
just
you're
doesn't
questioning.
accredit.
Now I'm questioning myself.
No, he's like just not accrediting type, but I feel like this is,
It is very similar to Accursed Share.
yeah.
I mean, he does later on, even in this chapter, reference the sun, I think even directly. I could even control F this and see what the specific range. I think it's later on in the chapter.
Yeah, even in that quote, he contrasts, that one implication of expenditure as involving a return with the other implication of expenditure as pure loss, which we went over last chapter. So I do think Bataille is, even if he's not named here, I mean, Bataille is the thinker of pure loss expenditure, or at least in my mind, he gives it a logic. And Lyotard, I don't know if he ever directly quotes the Accursed Share in this text, but he's constantly looking at Bataille's literature, as we've seen. But of course, even in this this text is not a typical scholarly like citation text, so it's kind of like what we went with Lacan, where he's just throwing Lacan's name out there without necessarily wanting us to look at any one, writings of the Acri or anything like that.
Here, I'm gonna read this little section because I think it kind of sutures these two things together because it discusses both. And so the head, which is unemitted semen, climbs toward and collects itself is not a mystical head, but more bureaucracy. For this head is the head of a family chief, and this chief will be all the more powerful the greater number of male children he has, and they will be all the more numerous and energetic the more he has hoarded his sperm, and his treasure of sperm will be all the richer the more concubines he has. Therefore, the richer or more capable he will be, a military man, a man of high office, procuring for himself numerous women. In short, through this, the woman totally fulfills the function of an energy source. You could say the sun, soil, labor force, waterfall, wind, from which he must appropriate for himself the force that she can provide by optimizing her yield and transforming her into another form of energy, children here, which in turn, by transmutation, will give a supplement of energy, in this case, a large family, many fine male heirs, enabling the extension of the family and its powers and its clientele over the spaces on which the bureaucratic hierarchy is superimposed.
To take seriously the joke I made earlier, there's a huge crossover for me between Lyotard's conception of energy expenditure and entropy as it stands, especially as entropy comes into cybernetics as sort of, well, is it true that you need to expend energy continuously, that, you know, there is a heat death of the universe at the end of a certain amount of time? And within cybernetics and through the concept of Maxwell's demon, there's almost promise that energy expenditure is not necessarily something that is inevitable. And the reason that comes through is Maxwell's demon is essentially a machine where you have on one side very cold molecules, you know, and on the other side you have very warm molecules. So naturally the molecules will move from one side to the other just by their sort of natural inclinations. But Maxwell's demon says, well, if you could actually have a little machine that could identify, you know, which particles are hot, which molecules are hot, and which are cold, then you could separate the two without having entropy. So essentially Maxwell's demon is a negative entropy machine. And I think the cybernetic hypothesis is then, well, if you have the proper information, then entropy is not necessarily inevitable. Like the inevitability of expenditure and chaos, so to speak, literally probably chaos in entropy, is not necessarily true. And there's almost this connection to Lyotard here of entropy not being necessarily inevitable, that each one of these systems sort of has their own, so to speak, cooling of the libidinal band, which in fact might be able to control the heating up of the libidinal band, so to speak. That the information from the coolings downs could actually have you control the expenditure of energy over a long time. Hence the, you know, even the Chinese erotics of not expending your sperm, not expending the energy source for the female, almost like given the information, the proper amount of information and representation needed to make that decision, that these things are not, so to speak, inevitable, or even like the Tao. It's not just the way. It's like you can actually use information to control the way energy is expended and to contradict in a certain way what is considered like the universal law of the universe.
It's interesting that he will in the next section bring up cybernetics, at least for a moment.
Yeah.
And I like that he, in the same breath, wants to relate it to Freud's, some of his earliest stuff in 1895, although he never published it until after, obviously it was published after his death, the Project for a Scientific Psychology, where he is thinking about the firing of neurons and physiological quotas of energy, psychological quotas of energy, etc. And he links it to some of the later stuff with Beyond the Pleasure Principle, right? This question of, as he says, Eros making wholes. And he literally says this Eros is centered on a zero, the obvious zero of homeostatic regulation, but more generally annihilation by the feedback, that is to say by the repetition of the binding function of the system's every insignificant disparity of every threatening event. So I like that, you know, if we go from, Chris, your cosmological view down to, I think that Lyotard's trying to say that we can see the analogies are, you know, superimposed on the cosmological model that you were bringing up with Maxwell's demon, this question that Freud has about how the psychical apparatus deals with tensions, with surplus energy, right? And for Freud, it's always about discharging. It's always about a healthy discharge, which is why he mentions the binding function there, right? That the psychical apparatus, when it succeeds in mastering some unforeseen event, it's able to not just incorporate it, but able to take on that stimulus, that charge, and in due time bind it, so to speak, render it non-lethal to either to the sheath of the ego or to the, you know, to the functioning of the apparatus itself, and then discharge that tension, which for Freud is precisely what the psychical apparatus does. It's meant to be able to regulate that, ideally at least, right? Optimally, it's meant to regulate the tension in the system. You
mentioned the discharge, or like this dissipation, you could say. It reminds me of like the structures like a heat sink, you know, like in a computer, for example. just to make the analogy more concrete, may use a
great.
hardcore metaphor.
Yeah, I think I even like referenced that specifically in the
Go
notes,
on.
and go ahead.
But in terms of the heat sink, you could say there are these integrated structures which help or allow for the dissipation of energy, this excess. And as you stated, Taylor, for Freud, it's always this discharge. It's like how can you return back to this? You could say, how can you return to an lower energy state, like in chemistry? So it's like, in a way, I feel like with libidinal economy, it's like, how can you return back from these high intensities of libidinal intensification back to these lower strata, if that makes sense. We're analyzing it from this libidinalized lens, and how do we make sense of these social phenomena then directly and making analogies to these higher intensities, really overextending the heuristics or the models, for example.
Yeah, I see, Coop, your note.
Yeah,
that
was good.
And Q, yeah, I was just thinking, Lyotard, contra what Tikkun in the cybernetic hypothesis, at the very end, they've been quoting libidinal economy throughout the whole text, and then they kind of give some reasons why Lyotard went astray in this book. Now, Lyotard has his own reasons for calling it an evil book, whatever. I don't find Tikkun's critiques to be on point, and I'll just give one of them. The one thing was that Lyotard for Tikkun, they say that Lyotard is like, don't worry, go enjoy, yada, yada. And I don't necessarily, from our studies together, I don't see that as following, because I don't see Lyotard necessarily saying, and you're putting it correctly, I don't see necessarily Lyotard being like, okay, we need better ways of regulating intensities, or we need more logical ways of the intention behind intensification. I think Lyotard is not giving us some kind of prescription or program and he's not telling us to go out and enjoy, or he's not even telling us to not come. He's showing the logic, what's behind the logic of not coming in the history of thinking. Yeah. Right. And it does seem for Lyotard, this is not a text that we're going to necessarily get all the answers from. And he's kind of forcing us, and I think we might see in the last chapter, but it's reading the book itself is this kind of intensification protocol, but it's not necessarily going to give us all the answers. It's not pretending to. And so I only brought up Tikkun just to say, like, I don't find it to be, it's kind of like some misreadings of Foucault's History of Sexuality, where he says the exact opposite of what he's being critiqued for, which is like, oh yeah, sexual liberation, we're all free now. And Foucault's like, no, that's not, that's all. And so I see the same thing going on when it's like, did you read the same Libidinal Economy, right? Like, I don't see in the whole book, I don't see Lyotard championing intensification in itself. He's laying it out for us and we're going along, but he's not just, hey, go have fun. I don't see that.
Stick to the intensities. Don't represent it at all.
Right. Right.
I'm completely against cybernetics, Yeah. No, it's like, it's there's no normative judgments there whatsoever.
Right.
It's almost like a scientific theory in and of itself. I think that's the best way I could put it. It's almost like its own cybernetics in a way that rejects cybernetics as the be all end all representation of the cooling of the band, yet understands that cybernetics is one such arrival of the cooling of the band.
In a lot of ways, just to kind of piggyback on that, they forget who quoted this, but they talk about how Deleuze and Guattari's work is engineering manual or something,
Right.
It's like explicitly trying to be something like that. So I feel like in the same line or in the same trajectory, Lyotard is doing something very similar by kind of, as you put it, Young, making his own cybernetics. It's like, well, this is how you follow through with what he's saying, taking what you're saying, practicing what you preach, and then so libidinal economy itself, the book, is a result of this, following through all the way through an intensity. It's not fetishizing intensities for their own sake, as you were saying, Taylor. It's, putting that into practice. I want to say, like, becoming imperceptible, right?
Yeah, I guess my main point was that insofar as he's trying to get us to see libidinal economy and political economy in the same lens, in the same frame as taking part in the same system or being the same thing, I don't necessarily see that as championing a sort of, it's not necessarily like multiply your polymorphous perversions. It's that you already are that. You don't have to go out and have an ethics of the orgasm or an ethics of intensity, right? It's the fact that is what we are faced with, and we have to see that. So I think it's just a totally, I guess that would be the thing where if you reduce this book to it being a kind of go out and find your own pleasures and multiply them, then I think that you reduce you kind of throw this book to the side and say nobody needs to read it, when in fact, I mean, reading it is an event, as Coop has kind of talked about, why the writing is so ineffably moving, right? Because it fucks with you, and it doesn't give you answers, and it doesn't pretend to. It forces you to think through these things and to have these thoughts and these intensities that you can't necessarily do a lot with. And so it does build up some tensions, and makes your blood boil and shit, right? And that's how I would see the book, more as an intensifier for us thinking and feeling differently than saying how we should do that.
Yeah.
Just to piggyback off what you just said, Taylor, because I think that's a really good nugget. You mentioned it early too, Young, about this intensification of the libidinal band. And it's like, this book is exactly that in a way. I guess it's a really good way to start the book, which is he kind of spends a lot of time diagramming or showing how the libidinal band works in the first place, or like how you can conceptualize it. Because on one side, at this hyper-rationalistic, we constantly try to create these models of how the world works, and it's like we try to superimpose them, and it's like, oh well, you can boil down economics to signs or blah blah blah, like these really rational. All of modernity has these meta narratives, right? These fixed structures, you keep building up on them, and that's just how the world works. And it's like what we'll see later on in Lyotard's work with his attack on meta narratives, as his definition of postmodernism. It's kind of really writing these intensifications to kind of dissuade us from those hyper rationalized viewpoints. As you mentioned, Taylor, it's like you already are this, to use Deleuze and Guattari's language, you already are this multiplicity. Right. So how do you go from that understanding? How do you make theory? Your ethics is already a molar ethics, for example. So you don't have to use contemporary examples. You don't have to be a politically correct mainstream sex liberationist or anything like that, if I'm making sense. That's like the fetishized 5th grade interpretation, in my opinion, of what we should be doing, if that makes sense.
I guess it's the question. It's like, we just to stick with Deleuze and Guattari, is I thought it was funny talking about it as like an engineering manual, right? Anti-Oedipus. But I mean, they do ask this question about what is a book for? What is its use? Right? At least they say that in A Thousand Plateaus more concretely, especially in relation, and Deleuze already said it in relation to Proust's work, right? It's like how the book reads into us, et cetera. And I think that the question about libidinal economy, and again, maybe why Lyotard goes on to discredit it, is precisely because it, as I said, it's not a program, and it's almost a schizophrenic machine. It's not easily sayable what its effects will be, right? It is kind of this intensification experiment, and so we can't necessarily say it's a tool for mobilizing the proletariat or class consciousness, or that it's a guide to living well,
the non-fascist life, the manual to the non-fascist life.
Right. It's hard. It's hard to say what the effects will be from reading Libidinal Economy, and given how much is going on throughout the text, you could read this book several times, and each iteration would bring you something new and give you new affects, new effects, potentially in subtly how you're thinking differently, because it's not like Lyotard's. A lot of the times he leads us down these false paths and puts forward these alternatives that seem interesting. And then immediately, I mean, we see it in this chapter too, immediately he'll be like, don't think that. Right. He'll make us think that, and then fuck with us and be like, no, that's the wrong path. That's not even the right question. And so like, that's part of the power of this book, is that it's not necessarily, one doesn't necessarily need to read this book to understand either later Lyotard or other thinkers. And it's precisely, I think that's one of the beauties of it, that it's not just something in a toolbox. It itself is kind of calling into question our own proclivities for the tools that we have, that we fetishize, and the different moves we theoretically make, or the different, strategies of thinking. I mean, he is kind of calling all of this into question and never once telling us where to settle. I think that's what Grant tries to get out in his introduction, in his translator's introduction. He tries to kind of show that Lyotard is perpetually trying to unmoor us. I mean, we talked about destratification and deterritorialization earlier, but I do think Lyotard, instead of describing that or saying, here's the logic of it, I mean, he's trying to do that, and we can either, and we go with him or we don't. A lot of times we're, as I said, we're always kind of lagging behind or drifting off. And I think that's Lyotard's goal. I mean, Coop said it like with the last chapter title, The Economy of This Writing. I mean, Lyotard is consciously aware that bringing in all these disparate elements, Taoist erotics and the stock crash, he's trying to get us to think about all these different things as relative to, if there is a fundamental thesis, it's that libidinal economy is political economy, and it like that. But even that, I think Lyotard wants to continue to like poke at and to say, okay, well, what does that mean?
Right.
What is that? How does that, how does that change our way of viewing phenomena? He's not going to tell us that. We have to find it for ourselves.
I think when you put it in terms of affects, that I really like that, because in your metaphor of picking at it, if we use the metaphor he uses at the beginning of the book, flattening out the body, it's kind of like this matryoshka of affects. You can keep breaking it down, splicing it,
right,
breaking it down, and you're never going to get to some fundamental like sediment.
Yes,
almost like a Gödel theorem. Yeah,
right. Yeah, you can keep going all the way down. In a way, Lyotard is making you to coin the same logic that Deleuze is kind of trying to make you do. It's a book that tries to make you to think. It pushes you to think, and it takes you on this, these trajectories, these lines of light. It doesn't hold your hand. It's trying to make you think, and it, like Taylor mentioned, it gets you mad. And other times you're like, wow, this is really good. And then it just, it's kind of like this foreplay that that Lyotard is trying to do in a way that's like, it's so own and self-enclosed cybernetic affect machine.
Yeah.
Well, I like that.
Yeah. And that sort of speaks to what I finally found, I think, in this chapter as one of the through lines to the postmodern condition, which is his sort of comments on science, which come in this chapter. And I'll read a quote from 215 where he says, "Today's science is at first glance merely research into efficiency, that is, into power.
Right.
And on the second, merely the production of strange and efficient fictions," which fits perfectly with, right? And fits perfectly with postmodern condition. If you've read it, is sort of arguing to a university. You wrote that as he was commissioned to write it for a Canadian university. And I thought it was Toronto, but I could be completely wrong.
I think
for
it's
some
Quebec
Canadian university. Oh, Quebec, exactly. Quebec University. And there's this through line to the postmodern condition where he sort of expresses the danger of science becoming the ultimate meta-narrative, or, the ultimate fiction of what's at the base of everything. But he also says then what we can understand is that science, in a way, is the greatest madness of sort of like consensual madness of the entire populace. Because he says on 215 later, he says basically that the madness of the great zero, and so to speak, is its desire, this is quoted, its desire to bring a body, which can only, quote unquote, be if it is represented, to a standstill. So science is basically the desire for a great zero itself. It's not an objective knowledge, as anything is not an objective knowledge in a certain way. It's a slowing down of the band. But science is masquerading itself as the great zero itself, as the be-all, end-all objective findings of the human race itself. And they would believe that beyond the human race, these things would hold true. So simultaneously, there's a through line here, but there's also this idea of madness as simultaneously something. I consider that pejoratively in a way, that science is sort of a madness, but I don't think we should take it that pejoratively. I think madness is actually a good thing. It's the carving out of a non-place.
Right.
The problem is science is just the biggest non-place. It doesn't exist. It's a non-place that was carved out, and it's beautiful, and it's weirdly close to reality. It's, you know, something that is a very compelling meta-narrative, but it's still a meta-narrative. And I think that point in this chapter, finally, I was like, okay, here's the Lyotard I know. You know, the one from the postmodern condition, the one who has this specifically skepticism of meta-narrative science.
Yeah, and the one thing that he seems to, again, to use that term, that through line to the later texts of the 70s and the postmodern condition, is this fundamental point that science doesn't give a shit about truth. That in its essence, truth is not the object, which is why he says here it's about efficacy, and that notion of fictions, which isn't, you know, we have to take it in a Nietzschean sense, right? It's not opposed to reality like an appearance or something like that, right? As you were saying, the term later will be these little narratives. You know, we have to learn from science that crafting of little narratives that don't turn back into, because you already see, I mean, if you continue your quote, I won't keep quoting, but he brings up,
absolutely.
He brings up little girl marks again, and this desire for, what does he call it? Social genitality. Is that the word? The desire for a social genitality in which all the partial pulsions would be reabsorbed. So this body of capital as a unitary totality, and how we have to see that as just as much of a meta narrative as the Moeller Marxist meta narrative of the end of history with the abolition of classes.
And it's like, Marxism. And it's funny too, because when Marxism, especially Marxism-Leninism, calls itself a science, you know, the famously the immortal science. It's like, well, you're striving what you don't even achieve, which isn't a bad thing per se. Right. But your goal is to be a science, is to be the ultimate meta narrative. And like, even in the articulation of what Marxism-Leninism is this belief that it is the ultimate meta narrative. And even Lyotard is saying, like, look,
materialism.
Marxism is great in the same way science is great. It's a great representation, but it's not the be all end all. It's not the way things work inevitably or organically
at all places at all times. And I think that's the big distinction for like the meta narrative of science too, right? Because it's contingent by what? By reproduction.
Right.
Can you reproduce the same conditions of the experiment, or like, I guess the conditions must be, there has to be a congruence of condition and outcome.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to speak on that more, because that was a really interesting point about the reproduction end of it.
Yeah,
I would be interested to hear what you have to say about that.
I was thinking about this too, like in the sense of capitalism not being a mode of production, but a mode of reproduction. And I think I might have even gone into this previously, but I had that thought this morning just in preparation of the text. And I think it very much like, maybe it's just libidinal economy has just seeped into my brain and is driving me in that direction.
Well, I was gonna, because I think that leads perfectly into he actually provides two uses of wealth, force and power. And the first one, the major one, like you just said, is reproduction, which he defines as circular, global, and organic, the way that the system reproduces itself. And then two, the pillaging, the partial, deadly, and jealous factor of power, which in his, I don't know if I can judge this because I'm doing a very bad logical almost fallacy here to say that like the first use of power, you know, therefore the most important or the most prevalent is reproduction, like you're saying. I don't know if I should do that, but I do think that you're right in that way, that reproduction is sort of the ultimate wealth in a certain way. The ultimate use of wealth is to reproduce the exact same system. And I think obviously Althusser would probably agree with me.
Yeah.
Althusser is very big into capitalism as not production, but the reproduction aspect.
The ISAs, the ideological state apparatuses, they're I mean, it's what in another register. Well, I mean, like you brought up Althusser because the ISAs, the apparatuses are for reproduction of it's basically social reproduction, right? So
exactly of capital, of the material reproduction.
And Deleuze and Guattari bring up the will to power when they talk about armies, states, we could say churches, I think is something like army stage churches, what's these old dogs wants to die, right? So this logic of self-reproduction is extremely important to libidinal economy. And we could, he doesn't say it here. He may bring it up earlier in the book, but this, you could obviously go to Freud. Here he goes to Freud and inhibition because he's working with the question of intensification and the damming up that we already talked about. But Freud also would talk about the compulsion to repeat. And so if we wanted to yoke in the ISA's, Althusser's notion of social reproduction with this compulsion to repeat, I mean, again, that would again make Lyotard's point about we have to consistently see political economy as libidinal economy. Yeah. Without any separation.
That's much a great point of this can be graphed onto the example of, the reproduction of the homoerotic Greek society, right? Like the same reproduction to keep that society, to keep the homoeroticism structures in place. And the only reason why they have that transactional, you could say, the transactional intercourse with their wives is to, propel, to reproduce, to perpetuate. And in a way, like capitalism does the same thing. It only provides innovation insofar as it's innovation to reproduce itself, right? Right. It's like, oh, well, this great new novelty is great insofar as it perpetuates the same thing. It's like the eternal recurrence, but the eternal recurrence of the same as opposed to like the more Deleuzian eternal recurrence. But I guess I wanted to tie this back to, I wanted to ask you guys a question real quick to what you guys think about this. How much of Lyotard's work could you maybe describe as a transition from, to use Foucault's work, there's a transition from an episteme to another, and we kind of are seeing it in terms of this kind of like trust in Marxist meta-narratives to these more atomized,
epistemically suspicious in a way, like you were saying.
Yeah, because to me it seems that's we're getting here. Like this, if he calls it his evil book, it's only his evil book insofar as he might even be holding on to, it's like, oh well, the Marxist meta-narrative still means something to him, right?
The Marxist meta-narrative is almost the intensity that he, in the same way that Kierkegaard labels faith as this thing that can't be reasoned. He understands that the Marxist meta-narrative is flawed, yet it's been a core aspect of his experience in life. I see the evil book of being like, he reached a point where he realized that Marxism itself is a meta-narrative. But after the fact, he was, well, leftist politics, Marxist politics, I shouldn't just abandon those, which is so interesting. Right. I really like the way you asked that question, because I think it's just the big question. Why does he disown this book? What is it about this book that is so antithetical to certain, I would call it quasi-meta-narratives of the left, quasi-meta-narratives of Marxism?
I assume that kind of like Deleuze and Guattari got mocked or anti-Oedipus with all the misunderstandings about, the schizo is the revolutionary, right? Which is just the which is the kind of joke that, and probably not so much a joke, but the misreadings that they heard. I assume that if this book made a tenth of the dent that Anti-Oedipus did, and I don't know that. It'd be interesting to know. I mean, Anti-Oedipus did have a kind of a, quote unquote, we could say it was a bestseller, right? Who knows if this book sold, but for those souls brave enough to read it, I assume the kind of questions he got. So what you really meant to say was X, Y, Z. I assume Lyotard was like, all right, I'm done with this fucking book. I'm done talking about this book. I don't want to explicate it. I'm not going to write another book to explain it, a reader's guide. Now, I'm giving a charitable reading because obviously that doesn't mean that he may have had specific points that he would retract or that would state differently. But it does feel like by calling this an evil book, he's like, we're going to speak no evil. We're not going to talk about it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I don't know if you remember, the only reason I fully remember is I listened to these episodes, which I think it was honestly the first episode we did. You actually talked very similarly, and we were talking about me and you had the same belief. I remember this exactly of Guattari and Deleuze and Guattari distancing themselves from call, people like you're saying would call the schizophrenic, oh, you're saying the schizo is the vanguard. Literally,
Right,
the schizophrenic is the vanguard of the revolution. And they were saying, no, you need to understand schizophrenia as an epistemic and ontologically different thing than catatonic schizophrenia or clinical schizophrenia, is what they actually call it. But it's like you're saying is like that disavowal itself is something to do with how Deleuze and Guattari had to come to those ideas. It's almost like a reterritorialization, we were saying, we were both saying in a certain way, actually, I think the schizo may be the vanguard of cosmological revolution, of revolutionizing the way that we rationalize the universe, so to speak. It's interesting that you have tied it in a way, because it's really opened it up to me of maybe in a certain way that idea is sort of speaks to the certain disavowal of this book that Lyotard has done, of saying this is an evil book. It speaks to something that I myself am not ready to accept because I need, in a certain way, as we all do, I'll admit it, I'm certainly a Marxist in certain ways, the meta-narrative of Marxism, of a political program, of things that are not just cosmological and epistemic or ontological, but political. There's like this realization in the same way that Deleuze and Guattari realized sort of like that maybe schizophrenia needs to be rejected in order to save their academic careers and the shelf life of their books. In the same way, Lyotard says, I want to be remembered as a Marxist. I want to be remembered in a certain way as a post-Marxist or a Marxist. And this book, in a way, I would say not even in a way, I think almost objectively speaking, is almost politically apolitical. You could read this book as any political ideology, whether it be extremely far right, extremely far left, or anywhere in between, above or below, and you would get something from this book that is not simply a prescription for political beliefs or to substantiate some sort of meta-narrative you have about history or ideology. It's a book that attempts a science in the same way Marxism does. And in the same way, I don't think he rejected it because of this, but it's also why he insists during the book that we should reject it as a science. The idea is science is not something that should exist as the be all end all objectivity, but there's something certainly in my mind intensely objective, and I mean that literally as an intensity of thought that pushes you beyond sort of the current rationalizations into maybe the next ones.
Yeah, my only response would be you're making me think now that the other reason, an ancillary reason for him to retract it or whatever you want to call it, renounce it, would be that, like you said, in this politically apolitical way, it can be open to appropriation.
Right.
But I find that less likely because, as we've already discussed, because of the difficulty of this book, because of the ingredients that he throws in, because of his insistence on never fully giving us prescriptions, that I find that less likely, but it's a possibility, right? Yeah. I do think it's kind of like him looking back at a post and being like, man, I got to delete this
exactly.
shit, right? It's like,
yeah,
this just kind of cringe. Or again, it's just in a certain way too, in an interesting way, by renouncing the book, he actually intensifies it after the fact.
Yeah.
Right.
More.
Right.
By saying don't read that book.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's a bad book. Right. There's a way in which that has the opposite effect, of exalting it in a certain way. But anyway.
In terms of jouissance of the book, that I think adds a certain jouissance in the kind of Lacanian fashion of transgression. There's a certain transgression involved in it.
Right.
Maybe a better question would be, it's an evil book in what terms?
To me, the book is a work of art. That's kind of one reading that I have of it as an art piece. Obviously it's not a novel, but I almost feel like it is a sort of novel theory. I mean, it's not,
fiction.
It's like a proto-theory fiction in a kind of way, although that's very like in a very abstract way, but I think it's certainly, I don't know, that's the feeling that I get strongly from it, is this is like a piece of art.
I mean, I think that's the right way to, whatever label you want to put on it. I think theory fiction is fine, because I think for Lyotard, the point is not to argue by thesis And
Yeah, he and this is where he
Yeah.
and Baudrillard share so much in that sense. And like you mentioned, I think in some of the previous episodes where he directly calls him, our brother,
yes, that's right.
right? And I think that that I can definitely see that. I wish they had partnered up and done something together, because that would have been just amazing. I'm very drawn to the sort of thing that Baudrillard does. He does a very similar thing. It's not about this sort of logical whatever. And I mean, if you go through and like read reviews of something like Fatal Strategies or whatever, people are going to say, yeah, there's no logical program here. This is something else.
Calling it a work of art is appropriate, because one doesn't come to this book prepared to read it. Even if you can do some of the legwork by studying Freud and Hegel and yada yada, which definitely helps. This is an event, right? You don't open the first pages and be like, oh, I recognize this is Aristotle. Like it doesn't follow. Even having read Anti-Oedipus, you're not like, oh, I was ready for the labia to be spread out. You're not. So it is an adventure. It's an event, and in that sense, it is like a work of art. And in that sense, it doesn't have truth with a capital T, right?
Yeah.
It gets back to what I was saying. It's what we get out of it. So it has these provisional truths for us.
It's actually really helpful to me. And I'll provide like a little bit of how I understand it, but it's literally exactly what Taylor just said. It's so interesting for me to think of this book as an event in the sense of the theory of an event, drawing from Badiou and other philosophers of the event as a singularity, and Baudrillard himself, who does this in The Spirit of Terrorism, which I had read recently, about the event, meaning that the event, what can be called an event, is something which is a singularity, something which doesn't have a ability to be deduced into an interpretation, meaning that like we can't all talk here about if libidinal economy is an event of a book. None of our interpretations will be exactly what the book actually was, because the book itself evades interpretation. But yet the book provides this extreme libidinal potency that Baudrillard brings up in The Spirit of Terrorism, where he's like, okay, terrorism is singular and potent because you can't describe what happened, because it, in his words, the symbolic exchange of death evades our ability to symbolically understand why somebody would kill themselves. Literally is how he explains it. But what I'm trying to say is, Baudrillard says, for us theorists, the theory should be equally, if not greater, in its interpretation of the event, almost greater than the event. Which is why Baudrillard says in Spirit of Terrorism, he's writing about 9/11, and he goes, the Twin Towers committed suicide, because he's trying to reach this interpretation that is at least commensurate with the potency of the event itself. Which I think that I'll try and tie it back in my own understanding of how the libidinal economy is sort of an event in this way, and that none of us can interpret it properly, so to speak, like you would somebody who's writing a book that's not an event, but is reducible to an interpretation of what's signified, so to speak, a structuralist almost interpretation of what's going on. It's a book that all of our interpretations, to a certain extent, exceed the confines of the interpretation of the book and sort of chart out a new path that is equally as singular as the book itself. Your interpretation should exist as a singularity in the same way that the book is a singularity exceeding any interpretive reduction.
It's interesting that symbolic, or that act of terrorism, it contravenes this notion of, as far as, I said earlier, with capitalism being a mode of reproduction, right? Although there is the creative destruction element of capitalism too, though. Can capitalism absorb death? I don't, maybe 9/11 shows that it can, like, in a sense, right?
It can and it can't,
Yeah, I guess
symbolic exchange and death and Spirit of Terrorism, Baudrillard brings these pieces out, is no, because in a certain way, he believes the system of exchange, of the universal law of exchangeability, that everything should come to a complete imminence of being able to be exchanged or weighed upon calculation itself. Yeah. You should be able to calculate how much 9/11 cost, and that's the event, right? The problem is 9/11 is obviously much greater than the material costs of the terrorist attack itself. It was something that And that's actually why, just as a slight digression, Baudrillard says the Twin Towers committed suicide. Because he's saying the whole relationship between terrorism and, the hegemon, the United States, is that we don't die because of terrorism. We die because of the response to terrorism. We die because of our own suicide, of the Patriot Act, national security measures that completely obliterate our state into a completely tyrannical authoritarian government of national security interests. He was keen on the fact that, no, it's not that they hit the building, it's that they hit the building and the building itself killed itself, because this is exactly how our system works.
It's funny, I actually saw a meme the other day, and it was showing that the towers were connected underground.
Exactly.
It was like a little like Yoop. Yeah.
That's why I love those. And that's why, in a certain way, also I'm like, Baudrillard was right,
Yeah.
Those interpretations, I love those. The memeing of it is so indicative of Baudrillard's statement that it's a singularity, that we can only, like, you can't even joke about it bad enough to elicit the same response as 9/11. You probably could in 2002, 2003, but these days you couldn't make a 9/11 joke that's as terroristic as 9/11 itself. Whereas Baudrillard's saying, I'm trying to do this. And it's funny that he didn't succeed, even though people hated it at the time. America was, don't read Baudrillard. He wrote this crazy essay. And he tried to do that, but it's now I can read it and I understand it, which means that he wasn't completely successful in operating as terroristically in terms of creating a singularity as the terrorists themselves. But that idea itself is interesting to me, I'll just say.
You could say that with time and with just things accelerating, and I mean that in a loose sense, not in, things continuing on in the same logic, the same vein, mostly in what Baudrillard had thought. One could say that because Baudrillard's comment about the Twin Towers committing suicide, because it doesn't affect us as it was intended, our repression collectively has been successful, right? We have forgotten what it was to harbor a knee-jerk reactionary type response to something as, I'll say, quote unquote, offensive, right? As what Baudrillard said. And so that the repression has been at least mostly successful, right? I mean, I'm sure there are some individuals who would still find that to be god awful, but on the other hand, is it more awful than the conspiracy theories that want to make it into an inside job? I'm leaving aside their theoretical speculative value and their truth value. There's something going on with the human mind to process that event that is recalcitrant and resistant to the normal forms of, to get back to what we said with Freud and cybernetics, right? That event was unprecedented, incalculable, unpredictable to some extent. And again, leaving aside whatever knowledge we may have had of, for the collective psyche, right? Something that we had to work through in our own ways, and we're still living in that aftermath. But for the four of us, it makes sense that statement wouldn't be as offensive. But I assume they would still be everyday Americans, where it would touch a sore spot.
That's why I love the metaphorical use of, and there's definitely been many, of the idea of false flags, especially when it comes to 9/11, right? There's been false flags everywhere, and we know that false flags happen. But 9/11 as a false flag, me personally, it could have been, but it's so disparate that it's not even something that you should probably accept as a theory. But it actually speaks the idea of a false flag, which you could argue in a completely Baudrillardian sense was the purpose of 9/11. That interpretation of 9/11 was probably one of the most terroristic things in world history. The fact that the national security apparatus and the surveillance state comes out of that specific interpretation of 9/11 provides credence to this idea that the real purpose, the singularity, would be to create an event that causes an interpretation so exponentially more potent than the event itself that it allows you to sort of create the thing that you wanted. So the false flag sort of like metaphor would be like, if you're a state, you would be like, well, if you have, and not like the strategy of tension in Operation Gladio, that was the explicit strategy, but we don't have enough information about 9/11 to say that that was strategic in any way. But you could argue in the Baudrillardian sense that if you're going to create an event that creates that much fear and that much vulnerability among the American people, that the reaction is so much more aggressive and potent in its ability to create, I would say the NSA itself has become massive. I mean, the digital security apparatus that allowed is far more terroristic in that it binds our liberation, our freedom as Americans way more. No, I would say almost infinitely more than the terrorist attack itself. If we had done nothing, if we said, okay, they got a building, they got a couple buildings, but we're not going to do anything else. No, what's terrifying, what's horrifying, what's wrong with 9/11 was the fact that we had the Patriot Act after it, which we're still trying to figure out exactly what that did, between the Section 201 and metadata, which basically this Patriot Act said that you can collect metadata on Americans, which means all of your calls, all of your emails, all of your posts, everything is tracked by the US government because that's technically metadata. They can't technically listen to your calls, but they do anyway to most Americans because two things: you can just not get probable cause because you have a FOA court, not FOA court, actually, it's the FISA court, which is basically supposed to be a court that's covert to decide if we need to spy on certain people in a foreign sense. But because we've done the laws, you can spy on an American if they're related or calling any foreign person, which is basically all Americans. So you basically ensured that they can now look at all of us. They can maintain that security apparatus simply because the event itself was so effective in producing this thing.
Yeah, I mean, my takeaway would be to say that the development of these conspiracy theories, these intense conspiracy theories related to this event in particular, is precisely everything you laid out is this realization that we did this to ourselves in the sense in which we allowed ourselves to become hyper fixated and cathecting and investing into this security apparatus. We did it to ourselves. And so retroactively, we look back and say, it had to have been an inside job. Look at the power that the state amassed in these areas. Look at the wars they were able to participate in. Bush got to, avenge his daddy, that kind of shit. We rationalize in that retroactive way when in fact we're imposing a teleology because again we desperately want to understand the fact that
why
that the event makes sense in hindsight if we did it to ourselves, when really what we did to ourselves was the aftermath, right? This is why Lacan says the repressed and the return of the oppressed are the same thing. It's just that by the same thing, we mean this retroactive deferred action, right? The Nachtraglichkeit of this after the event, where looking back, it's 2020. It totally makes sense. Yeah, it was an inside job. But that logic doesn't hold, looking forward and saying that the state's going to do this big thing and it's going to be such a effective emotional response, and we're all going to be patriots again and all this stuff. That kind of planning in advance always is bound to be met with the skepticism of, but governments are fucking stupid,
right?
Most of the time, and to impute to them the kind of power and foresight and planning, etc., it would take to end where we are, which is much more dystopian than we could have imagined before the event. I'm neither for nor against. I'm merely saying that there is this logic that the rise of conspiracy theories isn't just concomitant with the loss of truth and Lyotardian down with meta narratives. It is partly with with the acceleration of technology and these other things and events happening at a more rapid
accelerated
pace,
clip.
we are wanting to find a logic and a coherency in this retroactive looking back and thinking that power where there isn't.
Yeah,
and that's the miscognition of the conspiracy there, right? Like it's the idea that it's actually wrong completely to call it a miscognition. It's the way that we actually come to cognize or to understand itself terrorism, because terrorism is effective in its response to terrorism, right? So we're saying like the government clearly planned this because now they have this huge security state, and 9/11 was like the biggest factor in allowing them to create, what we imagine their utopia, which is the ability to control us completely through surveillance. And we actually understand that as the fact, but think of it this way, it's like, it's not actually the government itself, most likely, in my opinion, that false flagged this thing. It's that we're using conspiracy to properly understand the effectiveness or potency or intensity of terrorism. Not to say that they planned on this happening, but they had a slight idea in sort of the intensity of their being and the intensity of their act of what would result is that if you provide an act of terrorism that is that much a singularity, the state will respond in a way that is, disproportionately hurtful to itself because it can't symbolize death. It can't understand why we would kill ourselves in order to hurt it. And the state itself probably doesn't necessarily plan those things, but the terrorist on a certain, probably unconscious level understands that in doing the act of terrorism, it's achieving its goal not in the act of terrorism, but in the secondary response of creating fear in the state to the point where it would eradicate the freedoms that it provided to its citizens in order to provide security. It's almost like the terrorist understands inherently the singularity of the interpretation of its act, not the singularity of the event. The terrorist understands, certainly in a certain unconscious way, that what it's trying to achieve will be produced by the reactive, responsive act by the state and not actually by the action it's going to take, which I think is objectively true if you look at the terrorist sort of historical materialism, so to speak, of like what happens after terrorism. Now, I will say quickly, just to qualify my statement, that the US government especially has been very aware of this fact. And that's why Operation Gladio was so successful in Italy, especially, because it realized that if you give bombs to fascists and they bomb things, and then you give bombs to Marxists, but also probably more likely fascist terrorists who will pretend to be Marxists, that you can create exactly the thing that you want, which is almost a state totalitarianism, because people will give up their freedoms in order to reach that level of security, so to speak. So Operation Gladio proves that there is a direct interpretive method here, but it doesn't speak to the fact that the terrorists have the upper hand and that they understand that what they're doing will be sort of like the fruits of their labor will be received in what they've done to the state to respond to their action, not in blowing up a building. It's in the state's response to the building.
I guess the whole thing you guys have been mentioning, which I think is great in terms of how it seems like conspiracy theories, as they relate to the postmodern man's epistemology, to give credit where it's due, I think to some extent Kantbot is right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Say what you will about Kantbot, but in terms of what we've been kind of observing up until now, especially with, not to give too much rise or credence to QAnon and stuff like that, but
right,
American German idealism, if to give it a pretty name. It's not as you were kind of maybe hinting at, Young, it's not like the event that matters, it's the meme. The mimetic repercussions that something has is kind of like where the government has opportunities to re-territorialize. I mean, you saw this with COVID-19, just to kind of bring it to a more recent event. It's like people give all this kind of credence to, oh, well, China planned it, blah blah blah, and regardless of whether or not China planned it,
Or the
regardless
US,
of whether or not, or the U.S. or whatever, because I think governments are too stupid to do something like that. But regardless of whether or not that's true, it's how governments in general react to things like that. It's an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity to re-territorialize. It's an opportunity for markets to restructure. That gives you, I mean, you saw this with layoffs. People got laid off. They still don't have their jobs back. And it's just going to be hoisted as this is how the market advances and it's too bad for you. So it's, as I mentioned, it's not the event that matters. It's like, it's the meme. What happens afterwards, how we handle it.
Specifically as the hegemon interprets the event. That's what the terrorist understands best.
Which I think is kind of what I like to think of myself as a Marxist too, right? But
we all do. We all want to be a Marxist. But
we all want to be a good girl Marxist, right?
Unfortunately, Marxism just doesn't exist anymore in its orthodox sense.
It's what's kind of right about Moldbug, and kind of why I think people say, oh, Moldbug is kind of like, an Anglo Foucault and stuff like that. It's like, in a way he is, because you kind of realize that whatever the current idealistic hegemon is, that's how, for example, democracy as an organ of control is going to react to whatever is opposed to it. And the rise of neoconservatism, it's going to wage war on the Middle East for oil. And the rise of politically correct politics, it's going to be wide censorship across the internet, not for the benefit of the left liberal. It's going to be in the benefit of the centralized power of the companies. It's not for the individual, which it masks itself under. It's
right,
which I think is kind of where the right wing cathedral enthusiasts kind of get it wrong. It's it's apolitical. It's
right,
for the benefit
exactly.
It's for the benefit of whoever's in control of those servers.
Intelligence. It's just to bring it back to Lyotard for a second, is he makes this point that the centralization of intelligence is inevitable. And it's also inevitably towards whoever has the resources to centralize intelligence. So literally in the United States, you can think of the United States general intelligence in the Riza Negarestani sense of general intelligence, so to speak, is the CIA, or the intelligence community. They literally name themselves intelligence. It's the centralization of all information towards a particular source is inevitable, regardless. But there's also the inevitability, if that's inevitable, that if you have more intelligence, you're also able to manipulate people towards whatever specific normative beliefs you have using that intelligence. If you know everything about everybody, which they clearly do, because I put everything about myself out on basically open cameras and posts, emails, which we know for a fact they're reading, at least through a computer. They know us very well. The intelligence apparatus, the centralization of intelligence is inevitable, according to Lyotard.
I think maybe we can pivot back to, and I'll throw this as an open question perhaps. What do we think? I think perhaps like the credit, like this element of credit, and particularly like as viewed like in the sense of delaying gratification, and especially as referenced in here is like the story of the cheese, like the cheesemonger, I'll call him, right, that is continuously running out. So he's operating his shop and running over to exchange the currency that he's receiving to buy more cheese, so that because the currency is fluctuating so quickly that he doesn't want to lose, right?
Yeah, immediately runs to buy cheese.
Which is kind of funny that I think like he's a literal cheesemonger, right?
Right.
Cheese pilled, one could
cheese
say.
Like in the sense like cum, right, or semen.
Yeah.
Or in the sense of money. Sometimes I don't know if anybody says it anymore, but
Oh yeah. Give me the cheddar, right? Yeah.
Yeah, right.
True.
Yeah.
Good call.
That's funny. Yeah.
I mean,
I
we
didn't even
talk,
think about that.
we talked a little bit about this yesterday, Coop. But just to be quick about it, I think we talked a little bit about the question of the velocity of money, which is just the rate at which notes or coins are exchanged. And I mentioned to you that this is why I was reading Copernicus. He was one of the first to like theorize it, or at least to kind of give it a simple mathematical notation. And I was telling you about how Henry VIII, at a certain point, he wanted more silver. This gets us kind of back in the trade chapter, but it's important here, right? And so he instituted, he had the mint, the state mint, new coins, but they weren't worth their weight in silver. They just had this, they had the king's semblance on it, so it would be guaranteed for the rate of exchange. And yet, so what happened was that the old coins that were worth their weight in silver began to be hoarded, and the only coins that were really used in exchange were the new coins, right? Because people didn't want, there was fear that the king's decree could be overturned or not given. And then what's the question about these coins outside of the kingdom, outside of, Great Britain or England or whatever? They're not going to have the same exchange rate. And so you see a lot of political fallout from that, and some headaches, from this mercantilist side. But with the cheesemonger, right, with this rapid fluctuation of currency, it is this, it's almost the opposite, right? Where, you don't know if anyone's going to want that money, or if that money can do anything at all, can be circulated. And you see the crisis that he has, and yet he's still almost even more intensely invested in this movement of commodities because of the fluctuation.
Oh,
it's counterintuitive to a certain extent, but but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Yeah, what he says here, because at first he gives us sort of this history of Aristotle's apprehension as to speculation. And he says, Aristotle views speculation as counter to nature itself. He's like, this is not something that's natural. It's almost, I would say, homosexuality. It's reproduction of itself, infinitely. I would say that's a connection to homosexuality in the Chinese erotic. And he's like, this contains what he considers a potentially dangerous infinity, because you can speculate forever. We see that with any commodity, but, right now it's Bitcoin. Bitcoin could potentially just infinitely go up. If you invested in Bitcoin when it was first invented, your percentage increase would have been like hundreds of thousands of percent. So it's like, yeah, you can go infinitely up with Bitcoin. What Lyotard says is that kind of need or limit, for things that Aristotle presupposed, he presupposed need, that we would need certain things, and that you can't just infinitely increase the price of something and expect it to always go up. He says that can't actually halt the process of circulation.
Right.
Speculation is actually kind of like a built-in thing.
I think and it's interesting that it's the speculation on credit that coincides with what you were saying about there's something unnatural about that. That it's the fact that there's no surplus revenue that's held in abeyance, right? That it's speculation on nothing, so to speak, or speculation on it's the unpredictability of the call loans, at what point they can be called in at any time. And I think this is on my version it's 234. Coop, it might be another page or two for you, but it's he says credit money circulates here according to a time which is not that of productive capital. There is no longer a natural cycle nor anything comparable. There's no longer any cycle at all, only upward and downward trends and their reversals, which in a turbulent period are unpredictable. So that gets kind of back to what you were saying about Aristotle and this unnaturalness. It is interesting that Lyotard points out it's a totally different temporality, right? It's a totally different time than the body, the thing of the commodity being part of the surplus of a reservoir to be held liable for the exchange. It's similar to what Dante does in the Inferno with the usurers and the high interest rates, which Aristotle too points out. But
in
he
the Bible,
uses
Jesus
he uses a lot of these,
beats up the usurers.
Yeah, he
literally
uses
in the Bible.
A lot of these metaphors of it being unnatural against nature, and has kind of implications, like you said, of the standard trope of it being akin to a kind of homosexual activity, right? Except it's more abusive in a way. I think the usurers are down pretty fucking low in the Inferno, if I remember correctly.
I think they're in the bottom most.
They're getting towards the bottom. I think they're like the 7th or 8th circle. They're pretty low.
That's amazing. Can you explain that like a little further? Because that was amazing. I want to hear like a little more about, especially the homosexuality connection at the end there.
Yeah, I would have to look back at the Inferno to double check and
not the Inferno, but in the Lyotard, the idea of homosexuality with reproduction that you were saying.
Well, I think what I was trying to, I guess I may have mixed my words. What I was trying to say is that Dante uses some images of the usurers being unnatural, and I think that they're this unnaturalness, the tropes. It's basically like nature has been denatured and turned against itself, been corrupted, and I think that there are some images used. I don't know here if Lyotard is wanting us to think back to the Lydians or the Greek or the Grecians or anything like that, but I do think that he wants us to. I think the interesting thing that I found in this, whether we link it to homosexuality or not, because I'm going to go off on a tangent, but the thing that I found interesting was the fact that Lyotard points to the crisis really getting pressure built from all these loans are not coming from bank institutions, right? So again, it's not based on any sort of capital or commodities or what do you call them? Well, not commodities, but there's no reservoir kept. There's no bank to guarantee.
Right.
There's less and less of the banks that are guaranteeing these loans. It's more and more of these companies, these businesses who are fueling the intensification, kind of like what you guys were talking about with Bitcoin. It's fueling this intensification of more and more companies buying into this
potential,
the speculation on credit.
Exactly.
And
you think about, in the context of like the Dutch and tulips, right? It was literally called it was like a mania, right? Yeah. It's interesting that
say something about this. Say something about this.
Well, it was like in 16th, 17th century Holland, I guess, tulip bulbs became this crazy commodity and everybody was investing, and this sort of prefigures, it's one of the first
booms.
Yeah, exactly. One of the first speculative bubbles that occurred within the global economy. But it's interesting too, because it maps on directly, like a very similar thing occurs in the 29 stock market collapse, because you have another mania, this speculative. And you can see this mania of libido really is what's driving it. What's the old adage about the stock market? The markets can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. And so the markets, if the markets are a representation of desire and flows of desire, then, that mania sort of thing that overwhelms, or it breaks the circuits of logic within the system itself. Right.
Abundance of joy.
There's so much. Yeah, exactly. And this is where I'm curious. This could maybe even lead into, because he mentions Hegel having this negative vision of desire as a purely destructive force.
Right? He says Hegel says desire in its immediacy, in the immediate time frame, is a destroyer. It just destroys anything. If you need something, you destroy it. You eat it immediately. You just consume. The real concept of power that Lyotard comes up with is, he says that there's a potentiality, and he says, I'll quote in 219, a potential, and he calls it puissance, which we were talking about, like puissance instead of jouissance. And he says, in the sense of an operational virtuality, which is never without an organization of events into a past and a future, and their commensurability, or at least their co-conceivability. In other words, it's a postponing fulfillment which creates a reserve of energy at the same time as like a lack simultaneously. Right.
Yeah.
You know, awaiting the hour of its suppression or fulfillment.
What did I tweet? I tweeted something good earlier. It was what is capital but libido preserving?
Oh yeah, you shared that with us, I think.
Yeah.
Right, and I think that's kind of the heart of it. Why speculation on credit being more and more taken over by businesses. They saw what the banks were doing. They were like, hey, we want some of this action. And as I said, it's kind of a house of cards.
Yeah, action has,
and it's like who can come the fastest rather than
the slowest.
So you don't have the yin and the yang get unbalanced, right? Something like that, right?
Yes.
Like you don't have that rhythm.
Overheating of the libidinal band.
Yeah. So yeah, or just you could say whichever one you want to say, either all the water gets boiled out or the water, puts out the fire, however, whatever metaphor you want. But there is something about, and this is why the cheesemonger is caught up in this, right? Because everyone's coming, he's got to come along with them, because that money isn't worth, so the whole, and this is why he brings
quickly.
He brings up the CMC, MCM, those circuits become less and less tenuous, right? For someone like the cheesemonger, but also for some of these businesses who are more and more taking these extravagant risks. And it is kind of a who can come faster type of deal. And with the call loans, you have to, at any point, they can be like, all right, show me your semen reserves. And if you if you're all cummed out, it's like,
you're done. That's the thing. It's also about storing semen. It's about storing the semen too. It's about coming quicker, because it's like you're trying to attract people who come quicker. But literally, he says on 223, the question of capital is that of knowing how desire as a formative force becomes a reserve and institution. In other words, in this Chinese erotics of storing your semen, of storing other people's semen, of storing like the energy impulse of everything. In the same way that you can relate it to advertising as like overtly sexual. It's about having other people come quickly versus you being able to reserve as much semen as possible in this very crass way. That's what libidinal economy is.
Right.
It's the storing of semen, the storing of desire itself.
Time preference as well, right? Because here's where the imbalance is within capital, right? Because for the capitalist, for someone with capital, they have the ability to withhold their cum. They can hold on to, but if you're a proletarian, you have to come. You don't have the luxury to wait. You need to. It changes your desire. Exactly. Your desire is intensified in a sense. Or
it goes back to the Hegel thing of desire in its immediacy is destructive. In other words, you have to consume things because what you desire is immediately food, water, things for my family. Yeah. That's the immediate, you have to consume those things. Yet if you have those things, then desire becomes about how do you store desire?
There has to be a surplus or the whole system will collapse, because without the surplus, there's no stability to the libidinal band, and it over-intensifies and destroys itself, or it locks up in the reverse.
What we see leading up to all of these different the speculation on credit, and as we were kind of talking about this negative feedback loop where it gets out of control. It moves away from any type of recognizable equilibrium, and it starts to accelerate in a way that can't be. Basically, it has to lead to catastrophe, which it did. And then who suffers the most? It's not necessarily the big institutions or companies, even if some of them had to close their doors. It's what you were saying. It's the working class who inevitably suffers. Just like with the housing bubble in 2008, we saw that normal Americans were the ones who bore the brunt of the pain. Subsidizing after the fact the risks taken.
This reminds me too of this libidinal. So there's almost an analogy you could take between, right, because the male has the ratio of sperm within the ejaculate versus the one egg that is to be fertilized, right? There's a ton. So the metaphor would be labor as semen, capital as egg. Yeah. And so only one sperm can unite with the egg to reproduce, right? Right. So all the other sperm are effectively superfluous expenditure. They're like that smoke or that, right? Yeah, the heat that is absorbed by the heat sink, and that kind of. Yeah. And I think even here, this little section goes to it. A use of money that anticipates result yet to come, when its payment function is forced to settle a present or past debt. To this reversal of time responds a reversal of relations between commodities and money. The latter here takes itself as an end, while in interdomestic chromatistics, it is a means to the satisfaction of needs. MCM instead of CMC. Isn't this exactly the same reversal that coitus reservatus performs by postponing ejaculation, putting wealth into reserve as semen, as Dow intensifies therefore, or as a bureaucratic clientele? On the other hand, it excites those regions, the woman capable of providing it with energy. Doesn't the merchant extend the circuits of commerce by inciting new exchanges that will inevitably seem useless and even unnatural? And doesn't he, like the Oriental erotician, postpone ejaculation, that is to say, the use of goods that he causes to circulate for the benefit of that which alone can relate them, financial energy as money?
Yeah, it does seem interesting that we see with the 29, stock market crash, Lyotard is finally kind of giving us, I think, a concrete image of one of these, of the metaphor he's been using of the labyrinthine band, right? So this difference between, or this tension between the furiously circulating energy intensities, etc., and on the other hand, a slowing down and a pooling up and a reservoir of energy, a surplus, right? And so that the tension between those two, you see that there becomes a kind of paradigm shift and he tracks it. He does a good job tracking it, right? In the 20s, which we associate with this era of decadence, rightly or wrongly, but it makes sense analogously when we look at him pointing out year by year the amount of these call loans, these risky loans being taken on by the banks becomes lower and lower, right? That the banks become less and less involved, and they really are, as he says, don't start with production and profit, but with the bank and interest. That's where he tracks the eventual breaking point.
The future. Yeah.
Right.
That's the thing. I have a quote here where about credit and how it can buy the future, or capital, or saving reserve, which he also equates to labor reserve, capital itself. But this quote is from 227. He says, credit in its reproductive usage rests on this analogy. The future it opens up is no different from the past. The one and the other are identical in principle. This is why they are reversible, and this is how the creditor can buy his future. In other words, credit is the purchase of the future, or in other words, the destining, so to speak, buying the destiny of the future.
Just one quick comment, I guess, on what Chris, you just said. Kind of like you're buying the future, right? So it's kind of what you guys mentioned earlier about the homoerotic aspect of it. It's the buying out the conditions, which in a way you're buying out the current conditions that keep yielding the same amount. So and that way you're not buying change. What you're buying is, it's kind of like a game of, what is it called? Endurance, right? Mm-hmm. You're making sure that, everyone else is coming faster while you hold your load. And at the end of the day, the one who holds off the longest is the biggest winner. And at the same time, you can see this with Wall Street bets, just to kind of give a good common, more recent event. The last person to pull out is always the biggest loser in
Right.
these speculative bubbles. So
Yeah.
just kind of a tongue-in-cheek comment there.
Lyotard himself says basically that the stock market in this quote is now the battlefield in a field of conquest by means of buying and selling. On 227.
It reminds me of when he's referring to that battlefield, how in the postmodern condition, he'll talk about how it's not impossible to conceive of a future and where governments fight over information as they do now for territory. That I butchered the quote, but that's roughly what he says. In that regard, it's like, well, what is information but just another, it's an abstract commodity, right? It's not really something tangible. I mean, it can be when you're talking about like networks and servers and things like that. I guess like in the current age of information that we find ourselves in with, you know, these speculative bubbles, large portions of the markets being based on, what are they called? What is the algorithms that they use?
High frequency
formula.
trading.
Yeah, but they have the, I want to say like derivatives, but that's not true. Whatever, the equations.
Quantitative traders.
Yeah, like the actual the actual equations that they use, you know, that stuff seems to me what the market seems to be focusing more and more on, as opposed to the necessary labor inputs to sustain that. In a way, just to kind of bring this to what the differences between like China's economy and the United States. The United States economy is solely reliant on, it's a capitalism based on business. How much business, as in contracts, can you create, as opposed to actually creating tangible goods and services? So we saw that change, which I think Baudrillard kind of points out in terms of this transition to credit as this shift in the 80s towards the financialization of capital, as this is historical turn in capitalism, I guess.
This quote from the text, I think, is good and might be relevant here. Is he says, currency here operates basically as a sign of something else, a sign of industrial or commercial invested capital. It is not its own end, nor its own limit. These latter are new commodities which will be exchanged against it at the end of the cycle. The unreality of the advanced is therefore temporal, provisional. It will be exchanged for the proper reality of commodities. Of course, these are in turn only means, and it is quite certain that for capital, they're only means of reproducing itself while growing. But it is precisely this function of postponement of the sign which endows anything whatever with the status of reality in the system. The nothing advanced by the bank to the entrepreneur is a reality because it will be exchanged for commodities. By making this advance of nothing, credit money in sum does nothing more than complete this nature of the sign in the system, which is nothing other than to refer endlessly to other signs.
Just makes me think of that quote where he mentions energy as money, or money as energy. I'm gonna take that literally. Energy is just another fancy way of thinking about like energy or like labor inputs, and labor inputs are just how you're incorporating labor units into whatever value you're trying to produce. And in that sense, you can always revert down to the lowest energy substrate, which would be like in neoliberal capitalist societies would be oil. So I don't know. It's just a point of thought that I'm currently in, and makes me think of when I'm reading Lyotard.
Transcendental detection of oil.
Nice.
I think one last thing perhaps that I was sort of interested in was this function of money or like what I couldn't understand is what the fuck is surplus? How and where is it generated? Because this currency is effectively, there's an equilibrium that's reached. I give you the good, right? It's like there's an equivalency where it reaches zero between, I guess, if I buy something and give you money for it, we're coming to a zero, right? In a sense, or that's the purpose of money, is to have this equivalency system so that you can like balance the books, balancing the both sides of the ledger. But then what is surplus, and how is it related to that, to equilibrium? How can there be equilibrium or zero or settling of accounts with surplus?
Yeah.
Like that seems like a contradictory sort of thing that I never quite got.
Well, that's the thing, right? Like in Marxist terms, the surplus is coming from labor, so it's exploited
Right.
or alienated labor. And I think in some sense, Lyotard is saying that the surplus is a libidinal surplus, right?
Right.
It's libidinal these libidinal intensities. When you are taking or doing the bookkeeping, there's always a surplus of these libidinal intensities, the satisfaction, the oppression of the working class. They, they partake in their own oppression because, they revel or they enjoy the dissolution, the dissolvement of their feudal,
bodies, yeah.
their bodies and their feudal, or what is it, their peasant identities. And it's like, in that sense, it's like that surplus value that's not being taken into account is, one, you can equate it as oppression, but two, as a what's it called, as value that you derive outside of the transaction. So to go back to the prostitution metaphor, and quote unquote, she would get more than what she's getting paid for. There's,
Okay.
in an empowering sense.
Yeah. Okay.
She gets pleasure, but in another sense, that's sexual pleasure.
Yeah. No, that definitely that helped. I think as far as like on the jouissance side.
That's probably a good note to end on.
Yeah. No, I agree.
That was great, guys.
Yeah, that rocked.
Yeah, that was a great time. It's always very insightful to talk to you guys about libidinal economy. I know that's the only book we've technically read together, but it's like reading it with you guys is honestly like reading 5 books, because it's like all of us reading books.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. We're all bringing something to it.
Different
It's
perspective.
all, yeah. We're bringing a singularity to a singularity to tie it all back,
That is going to wrap up this installment of Wicked Lyotard Part 6, and I think we've got one final chapter that we'll be looking at in the next coming months or weeks or something, whenever we can get together again. This will be the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Adkins.
Yes.
Signing off for the week.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity. Including the ultimate form of singularity, which is
Insurrection.